Paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division are now on the ground in the Middle East. Two full Marine Expeditionary units, the 31st and the 11th, are either already in theater or closing in fast. The Pentagon has been actively weighing sending another 10,000 ground troops on top of that, a move that would push the total American ground force buildup in the region to somewhere close to 20,000 personnel, layered on top of an overall American military presence in the Middle East that already numbers around 50,000. And on national television, a retired four-star Marine general who used to run the entire U.S. military command overseeing this exact region looked directly into the camera and said the United States should seriously consider invading Iranian soil because possession of Iranian territory would be, in his words, a significant factor in future negotiations with Tehran. That is not speculation from an anonymous source. That is a retired Marine general who commanded U.S. Central Command from 2019 to 2022 on a national Sunday morning news program, openly advocating for a ground invasion of Iranian territory. And it's happening at the exact same moment the Pentagon is quietly building the actual ground force infrastructure that any such operation would require. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what's actually moved into the region, what a real ground invasion of Iran would require compared to what's currently in place, why Iran's own leadership is now openly discussing hostage-taking and counter-invasions of its own in response, and why, despite everything pointing toward escalation, the most current on-the-ground reporting says no invasion has actually happened or been ordered as of right now. Stay with me for the full breakdown, because separating the real troop movements from the speculation is exactly what this video is built to do. Quick note on sourcing before we start. Everything here comes from confirmed CENTCOM statements, reporting from CNBC, The Wall Street Journal, and the Soufan Center, an independent security research organization that has tracked this specific troop buildup in detail, along with direct, on-record statements from retired military officials and sitting Iranian government figures. I'll tell you clearly what's officially confirmed troop movement, what remains speculation even among serious analysts, and where genuine uncertainty exists. Let's build this from the actual numbers. To understand how serious this buildup actually is, you need the scale of it laid out clearly, because comparing it to history is the only way to properly judge whether an actual ground invasion is realistic right now. Beginning in late January of this year, the United States carried out what's now been confirmed as its largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, deploying naval, air, and missile defense assets across the region in response to escalating tensions with Iran. That buildup has included multiple carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald Ford among them, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st Airborne, the 10th Mountain Division, specialized units including Delta Force, Army Rangers, and Naval Special Warfare Development Group, alongside Marine Expeditionary units, drawing on the 31st and 11th MEUs specifically. It's worth pausing on the stated objectives behind that buildup, because they reveal how broad Washington's actual goals in this region have become over the course of this war. Official framing around this deployment has cited preventing further killings of protesters during the ongoing Iranian unrest that's run alongside this entire conflict, preventing and dismantling what the administration describes as Iran's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, preparing for potential strikes on Iranian territory, and, notably, an objective explicitly described in official planning language as regime change in Iran. That last objective in particular is worth sitting with, because a stated goal of regime change implies a fundamentally different endpoint than simply degrading Iran's military capability, or forcing a negotiated settlement over the Strait of Hormuz. It suggests at least some planning inside the current administration is oriented toward outcomes considerably more sweeping than anything discussed in the ultimatums or naval blockade coverage we've walked through in previous videos. Here's the number that should actually anchor how you think about all of this. Retired General Philip Breedlove, addressing this exact buildup on Fox News, pointed out that the 2003 invasion of Iraq required more than 300,000 American troops staged in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia before that ground campaign ever began. The current American force in the region numbers around 50,000 total. And critically, as Breedlove specifically noted, very few of those 50,000 are actually ground combat troops, with the overwhelming majority engaged in the airstrike campaign that's been running for months rather than positioned for a land offensive. That single comparison, 300,000 versus 50,000, with most of the 50,000 not even being ground forces in the first place, is the most important number in this entire story, because it tells you plainly that whatever is happening with troop movements right now, it does not yet resemble the scale of buildup that preceded the last major American ground invasion in this exact region. But does not yet resemble is doing important work in that sentence, because the trend line matters just as much as the current snapshot. The Wall Street Journal reported, citing officials with direct knowledge of the planning, that the Pentagon was considering sending another 10,000 ground troops to the Middle East, a deployment that would bring the total ground force buildup specifically, separate from the broader 50,000 figure, to nearly 20,000 personnel. That reporting came alongside confirmation that 2,000 to 3,000 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division were already being ordered into the region, equipped with armored vehicles and logistical support, joined by the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, already in theater, and the 11th MEU, based on the USS Boxer, reportedly about a week away from arrival at the time that reporting came out. I want to pause here for a second, because if breaking down actual troop numbers against historical benchmarks, rather than just reacting to a headline that says troops moving to the border, is the kind of grounded analysis you actually want from war coverage, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. I track every one of these deployments as they're confirmed, and I always put them against the historical baseline so you know whether what's happening actually matches the scale being implied. Let's keep going, because the next part of this story is where the debate among the people who'd actually have to plan this operation gets genuinely revealing. The Washington Post reported that the Pentagon has been preparing plans for what would fall considerably short of a full-scale invasion, describing instead weeks of ground operations built around a mix of special operations forces and infantry, rather than the kind of sustained large-scale territorial conquest that defined the 2003 Iraq invasion. That distinction matters enormously, and it's one that gets flattened almost every time this story gets covered in a 15-second clip. There is an enormous difference between raids, targeted incursions by special operations units, and supporting infantry designed to hit specific objectives and then withdraw, and an actual invasion, meaning the sustained occupation of Iranian territory with the intention of holding ground indefinitely. Everything in the current planning reporting points toward the former. Nothing currently confirmed points toward the latter. It's worth understanding why a raid-based approach would be considerably more attractive to military planners than a full invasion, given everything we've covered about the actual troop numbers currently available. Weeks of targeted raids required nowhere near the logistical footprint that sustained territorial occupation demands, no need for the kind of massive supply chains, base construction, and follow-on occupation forces that made the 2003 invasion require 10 times the personnel currently in the region. Raids can target specific objectives, whether that's degrading particular military installations, capturing or eliminating specific individuals, or demonstrating a capability without committing to the open-ended responsibility of governing or securing captured territory afterward. Given that the current force posture already falls dramatically short of historical invasion scale numbers, a strategy built around raids rather than occupation is simply a far more realistic fit for the actual resources currently deployed, regardless of whether it achieves the same strategic objectives a full invasion might. And this is exactly where the retired general's comments become so important to understand in proper context. Retired Marine General Frank McKenzie, who ran U.S. Central Command's operations across this entire region from 2019 to 2022, giving him direct command experience over exactly this theater, specifically advocated on CBS's Face the Nation for a ground invasion of Kharg Island, Iran's critical oil export facility that we've covered in previous videos, as representing almost the entirety of Iran's oil revenue capacity. His stated rationale was explicit: possession of Iranian soil, even a small, specific piece of it like Kharg Island, would be a significant factor in any future negotiations with Tehran, giving Washington physical leverage that airstrikes alone, however sustained, don't provide in quite the same way. Notice what McKenzie is actually proposing here, because it's meaningfully different from either a full invasion or a special operations raid. Seizing and holding a specific, limited piece of Iranian territory, an island rather than the country's interior, functions almost like an updated version of the exact economic leverage point we've discussed with Kharg Island's oil infrastructure, except instead of striking it from the air, McKenzie's proposal would put American forces physically on the ground there, holding it as negotiating leverage rather than simply degrading it through bombing runs. That's a genuinely different category of operation than either the raids the Washington Post described or the historical full-scale invasion model from 2003. And the fact that a former CENTCOM commander is proposing it publicly tells you this idea is circulating at a serious level within defense and policy circles, not just among cable news commentators looking for a provocative soundbite. It's worth thinking through what actually holding Kharg Island militarily would require compared to the raid concept discussed elsewhere in current planning. A raid, by design, is temporary. Forces move in, achieve an objective, and withdraw within hours or days. Physically occupying and holding an island the size of Kharg indefinitely is an entirely different logistical undertaking, requiring sustained resupply, air cover, and force protection against exactly the kind of counterattack Iran would almost certainly attempt against the single most economically vital piece of territory it possesses. That's a meaningfully larger and more open-ended commitment than anything else currently being discussed publicly in this war, which may be exactly why, despite Mackenzie's public advocacy, there's no confirmed indication that this specific proposal has moved from a retired general's television commentary into actual Pentagon planning. Interestingly, Kharg Island isn't the only piece of Iranian territory that's come up in this specific context. Separate reporting from earlier in this buildup noted that one of Tehran's own top lawmakers said Iran was anticipating a potential ground invasion of one of its islands, specifically raising concern around Keshem Island, located within the Strait of Hormuz region. The fact that an actual sitting Iranian lawmaker was publicly voicing concern about a potential invasion of Keshem specifically, rather than dismissing the entire scenario as unrealistic Western military posturing, tells you Iran's own government takes the possibility of a limited, island-specific American ground operation seriously enough to discuss it in public statements, even while the White House has separately characterized talks with Iran during this same period as productive, a characterization Tehran itself has denied. Let's turn to how Iran has responded to all of this, because Tehran's own public statements about a potential ground scenario reveal a lot about how seriously Iran's leadership takes this possibility, and the specificity of some of these threats is genuinely striking. Manouchehr Mottaki, Iran's foreign minister from 2005 to 2010, and currently a sitting member of Iran's parliament, said directly in a state media interview that if U.S. forces seize Iranian territory, Iran should respond by storming an American base through what he specifically described as a combined helicopter-borne and ground assault, with the explicit goal of taking American soldiers hostage. That is not vague, generalized rhetoric about resistance. That is a former foreign minister and current sitting parliamentarian describing a specific tactical concept, helicopter-borne assault paired with ground forces, aimed at a stated objective, capturing American personnel. That threat connects directly to a set of concrete scenarios Iran military experts and analysts have been discussing regarding where such an operation might actually be attempted. Iran and Kuwait do not share a land border, which means any Iranian ground incursion against American bases inside Kuwait specifically would require infiltration rather than a conventional cross-border advance. Analysts have specifically flagged the possibility of a combined operation involving the IRGC's extraterritorial Quds force alongside Iran-backed Iraqi militia groups known as the Popular Mobilization Forces, potentially infiltrating and briefly seizing Kuwaiti border posts along the Iraqi-Kuwaiti land border, a border stretching more than 150 miles. This isn't purely theoretical either. Kuwaiti security forces already intercepted an IRGC-linked infiltration team back in May, attempting to breach Bubiyan Island, a strategically sensitive port zone near the Iraqi frontier, a firefight that wounded a Kuwaiti soldier before 4 operatives were captured. That May incident deserves more attention than it typically gets in broader coverage of this war, because it's the single clearest piece of concrete evidence available that Iran has already attempted, on a small scale, exactly the kind of infiltration tactic its officials are now discussing more openly and at greater scale. A firefight that wounds a Kuwaiti soldier and results in 4 captured operatives isn't a hypothetical scenario analysts are speculating about. It's a documented, already attempted operation that failed to achieve its objective and resulted in Iranian personnel being captured on Kuwaiti soil. Any assessment of Iran's stated intentions toward Kuwait going forward has to account for the fact that Iran has already tried a version of this once, and it didn't work. Iranian officials have named specific American installations inside Kuwait as potential targets in this scenario, including Camp Buehring, Camp Arifjan, which functions as the dominant American logistics and sustainment hub in the country, housing prepositioned equipment and command infrastructure, and Ali al-Salem Air Base, located roughly 37 kilometers from the Iraqi border and serving as Kuwait's primary American air transport and logistics node. Iranian strike claims against all 3 facilities have specifically targeted radar systems, fuel storage depots, communications nodes, and deployed rocket artillery systems, a targeting pattern that analysts describe as aimed deliberately at degrading command, control, and logistics capability, rather than seeking maximum destruction for its own sake. There's also a broader rhetorical escalation worth including here, because it goes beyond specific base names and infiltration scenarios into genuinely open-ended territory. Iranian officials have separately warned that, in their words, no political border will be safe, and that Tehran could pivot toward what was described as a full-scale offensive should Washington's military campaign against Iranian territory continue unabated. That kind of language, explicitly rejecting the relevance of political borders as a constraint on Iran's response, is considerably more expansive than the specific targeted scenarios involving Kuwaiti border posts or particular American installations, and it fits into the broader pattern we've covered elsewhere in this war of Iran, using maximalist rhetoric to signal resolve, even when its actual demonstrated capability, as the Bubiyan incident shows, has repeatedly fallen short of matching that rhetoric. Now, here's where the actual expert assessment becomes genuinely important to include, because it cuts directly against the more sensational framing this entire scenario tends to get in less careful coverage. Analysts covering this specific threat are highly skeptical that Iran could actually execute a large-scale conventional ground operation of this kind. The reasoning cited is consistent and specific. Iran's broader military doctrine is built around irregular warfare. Rather than conventional force projection, its actual capability to move and sustain conventional ground forces beyond its own borders remains limited, and the strong American and coalition military presence already established throughout the region means any significant Iranian troop movement toward these targets would be highly vulnerable to detection and interdiction long before it could achieve anything resembling the scenario Motaki described. One Iran military expert specifically invoked history to explain why even Iran's own leadership likely understands the limits of this option. Despite being considerably more militarily advanced now than in the 1980s, Iran still carries what the expert described as bitter memories of 6 years of unsuccessful attempts at capturing Basra during the Iran-Iraq War, a brutal, depleting campaign that ultimately failed to achieve its territorial objective, despite an enormous, sustained commitment of Iranian forces. That historical scar tissue matters. A regime that spent 6 years failing to take a single major city just across its own western border, during a war fought entirely within a region it knows intimately, has real reason for caution before attempting anything resembling a sustained ground offensive against a considerably more capable adversary operating with modern American equipment and coalition support. It's worth understanding just how significant that historical episode actually was for Iran's military institutional memory, because it's not simply an obscure footnote historians occasionally reference. The Iran-Iraq War as a whole ran for 8 years and produced casualties in the hundreds of thousands on both sides, and the failed campaigns around Basra specifically became emblematic of the broader war's grinding, costly stalemate, human wave tactics against fortified defensive positions, enormous casualties for minimal territorial gain, and eventually a war that ended largely where it started geographically, despite the staggering human cost paid to get there. Any current Iranian military planner weighing a modern ground offensive against fortified American positions, backed by vastly superior air power, precision munitions, and real-time intelligence, is operating with that specific historical lesson, sitting directly in the institutional memory of Iran's own armed forces, a lesson about exactly how badly an ambitious ground campaign can go, even against a less technologically advanced adversary than the United States represents today. The same analysis suggested one scenario that might genuinely shift Iran's calculations toward attempting something more dramatic despite those limitations: an actual American ground invasion of Iran's own southern coast. That specific trigger, and only that trigger, according to this assessment, might move Tehran to take what was described as unprecedented steps, even while acknowledging Iran would likely still struggle significantly if it committed to a full ground offensive in response. Let's talk about the actual pattern of strikes that's led some observers in Tehran to believe a ground invasion might already be in preparation, because this is where recent, very specific reporting becomes genuinely important. As the United States has continued bombing Iran's southern coastal cities and towns, including a confirmed strike on a bridge connecting Rudin and Bandar Abbas in southern Iran, concern has been growing inside Tehran that Washington may be preparing exactly this kind of ground offensive along that same southern coastline. Interestingly, this concern has produced a split reaction inside Iran's own political and military establishment. Some conservative voices are expressing confidence in Iran's ability to repel any American invasion attempt outright, with some hardliners even raising the prospect of a counteroffensive, an actual Iranian invasion of Bahrain and Kuwait, should the U.S. actually attempt to put ground forces on Iranian soil. At the same time, those same hardline factions have been increasingly critical of Iran's own government for continuing to negotiate with Washington to end the war at all, seeing negotiation itself as a sign of weakness at exactly the moment they believe Iran should be projecting maximum resolve. That internal split is worth sitting with, because it tells you something important about the pressure Iran's leadership is managing simultaneously on multiple fronts: a government facing hardline domestic criticism for negotiating too readily, while also facing genuine uncertainty about whether bombing runs on its southern coast represent a prelude to an actual invasion, is a government managing considerably more internal political complexity than a simple external United States versus Iran framing captures. Every strategic decision Iran's leadership makes right now has to account not just for how Washington will respond, but for how Iran's own hardline factions will interpret that response domestically. This dynamic echoes something we've touched on in earlier coverage of this war. Iran's government has repeatedly attributed provocative actions, whether attacks on commercial shipping or now potentially more aggressive rhetoric about counter-invasion, to hardline factions operating somewhat independently of centralized command. If that pattern holds here too, it raises a genuinely uncomfortable possibility that decisions about whether to actually attempt something like an infiltration operation against Kuwaiti border posts or a full counter-invasion in response to American ground action may not rest entirely with the same officials currently engaged in negotiations with Washington through Oman. A negotiating team that doesn't fully control its own hardline military and paramilitary factions is a negotiating team that can offer commitments its own government may struggle to actually enforce if those factions decide to act unilaterally, precisely the kind of command and control gap that should give any observer pause about assuming either side's public statements fully reflect what will actually happen on the ground. So, where does the actual most current on-the-ground assessment land, separate from all of the speculation, threats, and expert commentary we've just walked through? This is the part of the story that I think deserves the most weight because it comes from continuous day-by-day tracking of the actual military situation, rather than any single analyst's prediction. As of the most recent confirmed tracking, no U.S. ground invasion of Iran has occurred, and none has been officially announced. The broader U.S.-Iran conflict has, at various points, been governed by a signed memorandum of understanding. With the current status of that agreement itself disputed, Iran has described it as effectively dead, given the continued exchange of strikes, even as no ground invasion has actually followed. Throughout this entire war, from its opening days through the present moment, the United States has relied on air power, naval forces, and the naval blockade we've covered in previous videos, rather than a ground invasion, to prosecute this conflict. American forces remain positioned across the Gulf region, and Trump has repeatedly warned of renewed and expanded strikes if Iran continues violating whatever terms of engagement are currently in place, but a ground invasion has consistently remained outside the actual confirmed military posture, even while it remains a constant subject of speculation, planning discussion, and advocacy from figures like General McKenzie. Put all of these threads together, and you get a genuinely nuanced picture, one considerably more complicated than either invasion is imminent or there's nothing to this at all. The actual troop numbers currently in the region fall well short of what a historical full-scale invasion on the model of 2003 would require, by a factor of roughly 6, based on Breedlove's own comparison. The planning that has been reported publicly points toward limited raids by special operations forces and supporting infantry, not sustained territorial conquest. A former CENTCOM commander is nonetheless publicly advocating for a limited, specific territorial operation against Kharg Island, distinct from either the raid concept or a full invasion. And Iran's own leadership, while making increasingly specific and alarming statements about hostage-taking and counter-invasions, is being assessed by independent military analysts as lacking the realistic conventional capability to execute the scenarios its own officials are describing, constrained both by genuine capability limits and by its own historical memory of the costly, failed Basra campaign from the Iran-Iraq War. None of that nuance should be mistaken for reassurance that nothing serious is happening here. A genuine, confirmed buildup of thousands of additional ground troops, even one that falls short of historical invasion scale, still represents a meaningful shift in this war's posture from the primarily air and naval campaign that's defined it since February. And a documented, already attempted Iranian infiltration operation against Kuwaiti territory, however unsuccessful, confirms this isn't purely hypothetical rhetoric on either side. The honest assessment sits somewhere between the two extremes. This is a war where ground escalation, in some limited form, has genuinely become more likely over the past several weeks than at any earlier point in the conflict, even while a full-scale historical-style invasion remains considerably further from the current reality than the more sensational coverage of this specific story tends to suggest. Let's talk about what any of these scenarios, however limited, would actually mean for the people caught inside them, because even a raid-scale operation, far short of a full invasion, carries real human stakes that shouldn't get lost in the strategic chess piece framing. Special operations raids by their nature put American personnel into direct, close-quarters contact with Iranian forces on the ground, a fundamentally different risk profile than the standoff airstrikes that have characterized most of this war so far. Any scenario involving Iranian infiltration attempts against Kuwaiti border posts, as already happened once at Bubiyan Island in May, puts both American personnel stationed at those bases and Kuwaiti security forces directly in harm's way in a country that has repeatedly and publicly stated it did not permit its own territory to be used for offensive operations against Iran in the first place, meaning Kuwait itself is being drawn into direct confrontation risk over a war it's tried to avoid actively participating in. And there's a broader civilian dimension here worth including, because it connects directly to something we've touched on in earlier coverage of this war's regional spread. Roughly 90% of Kuwait's drinking water comes from desalination plants, according to reporting from the Associated Press, meaning any sustained campaign targeting that infrastructure, whether from Iranian strikes or as collateral damage from a broader ground confrontation playing out on or near Kuwaiti territory, would threaten an essential civilian lifeline for the entire country, regardless of Kuwait's own stated desire to stay out of the direct fighting between Washington and Tehran. The Gulf Cooperation Council's own Secretary General has already accused Iran of committing war crimes over attacks on civilian facilities and infrastructure connected to this broader conflict, a formal accusation from a regional multilateral body representing multiple Gulf states, not just an individual government's complaint. That kind of institutional condemnation matters because it signals the regional consequences of this war have already moved well beyond a bilateral dispute between Washington and Tehran, drawing informal responses from the collective diplomatic apparatus of the entire Gulf region. Any escalation into ground operations, in either direction, would almost certainly intensify exactly this kind of regional institutional response, adding another layer of diplomatic and political pressure on top of the direct military stakes already at play. So here's the honest, unhyped answer to the question this video's title actually asks. Is an invasion about to begin? Based on everything currently confirmed, the answer is no, not in the full historical sense of that word, and not on any confirmed timeline. What is happening is a genuine, measurable buildup of ground force capability, real paratroopers, real Marine Expeditionary units, real consideration of additional thousands of troops that remains well short of what a full invasion has historically required, alongside a live ongoing debate among the people who'd actually planned such an operation about whether something short of full invasion, whether that's targeted raids or a limited territorial seizure like Mackenzie's Kharg Island proposal, might achieve meaningful strategic value without requiring the kind of 300,000 troop commitment 2003 demanded. Iran, for its part, is responding to that uncertainty with increasingly specific rhetoric about hostage-taking and counter-invasion that independent analysts assess as considerably beyond what Iran's actual conventional capability and its own historical experience from the Iran-Iraq War would allow it to realistically execute. Before you go, two things I genuinely appreciate. First, if separating the actual confirmed troop numbers from the speculation and rhetoric gave you a clearer, more grounded picture than the headline alone could, share this with someone who's seen invasion imminent clickbait and wants the real numbers behind it instead. That's the only way analysis like this reaches people, instead of getting buried under shorter, louder claims. Second, I want your take in the comments. Do you think this buildup eventually crosses over into a genuine ground operation, even a limited one like Mackenzie's Kharg Island proposal? Or does this stay confined to air power and naval pressure the way it's been fought so far? Drop your thoughts below. I read every one of them. And if this breakdown delivered real value, hit like so more people trying to actually understand this specific thread of the war get the chance to see it. Let's close with the full picture. The current American military buildup in the Middle East represents the largest since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, including elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st Airborne, the 10th Mountain Division, and specialized units, alongside carrier strike groups and Marine Expeditionary units drawn from the 31st and 11th MEUs. But the actual ground force numbers, roughly 50,000 total personnel in the region, with most engaged in the air campaign rather than positioned for ground combat, remain well short of the 300,000 troops the 2003 invasion required, even as the Pentagon has reportedly weighed sending an additional 10,000 ground troops specifically. Publicly reported planning points toward limited special operations raids rather than sustained invasion, even as a former CENTCOM commander has openly advocated for a specific limited seizure of Kharg Island as a negotiating lever. Iran's own leadership has responded with increasingly specific threats involving hostage-taking, infiltration of Kuwaiti border posts, and a potential counter-invasion of Bahrain and Kuwait, all while independent military analysts assess Iran's actual conventional capability to execute any of those scenarios as genuinely limited, shaped by both current constraints and the lasting memory of a failed years-long campaign to capture Basra during the Iran-Iraq War. As of the most current confirmed tracking, no ground invasion in either direction has occurred, and this entire war has been fought through air power, naval forces, and blockade rather than sustained ground combat since it began. Whether that changes, and in which direction, remains the single largest open question hanging over the next phase of this conflict. Stay locked in, because the moment any of this crosses from buildup and rhetoric into an actual confirmed ground operation, I'll be covering exactly what it means with the same level of depth.